started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Leslie, and I'm a librarian at Superior Public Library. And we're so glad that you've joined us tonight for our first ever virtual Foolin Around with Your Family Tree genealogy event. Tonight's event is a partnership between Superior Public Library and the Douglas County Genealogy Club. And this year, we're excited to have WDSC, WRPT as an official co-sponsor of tonight's event. We've got some great speakers lined up who are ready to share their knowledge with you, tons of opportunities for you to ask all of your genealogy related questions. And I'd like just to run through tonight's schedule real quick so you have an idea of what's going to happen. In a couple of minutes, we'll introduce our first speakers for the evening. Their presentation will last about 50 minutes, and we've also included about 10 minutes for questions at the end of their presentation. Our next speaker will start at 7:15, and his presentation will last for about 50 minutes with another opportunity to ask questions. After the presentations are finished, we're going to have sort of a general Q&A where you'll be able to ask any questions you may have about genealogy that were not covered in tonight's presentations. Since there are so many of us attending tonight, we're going to respectfully ask that you use the chat box to submit your question, and we'll make sure that it gets answered during the Q&A. And many of you submitted questions ahead of time when you registered, and thank you so much for doing that. We'll make sure to address your pre-submitted questions during the general Q&A. So up next, we have David Johnson, the president of the Douglas County Genealogy Club, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the format for tonight's event, and then he'll introduce our first speakers for the evening.
Good evening. I'm David Johnson, as was said, and I'm the president of the Douglas County Genealogy Club. Well, I do appreciate everybody that has registered for this, our first online event, Foolin' Around with Your Family Tree. Normally we do this in person, and hopefully we'll get back to an in-person or a hybrid version next year. In your packet of materials, you should have found a registration form for our club, the Douglas County Genealogy Club. Dues are only $10 per year. It's pretty affordable. And we have monthly meetings, which are currently held via Zoom, but we hope to start our in-person meetings again sometime this year. We normally hold these at the Superior Public Library, but we do venture out to a few other places such as museums, historical societies, cemeteries even. So it's quite fun sometimes. You've got a few of the guidelines, but now I'm going to introduce our first speakers, Eileen Gannon and Lisa Hermity. Eileen has been interested in family history as long as she can remember, actively pursuing the hobby for 25 plus years, ever since her daughter installed Family Tree Maker software on her Windows 95 computer. Sounds a lot like how I started. Along with the basic tree she had created, and said, "Here, Mom, I don't have time for this anymore." And genetic genealogy has become her newest passion now. That was discovered in late fall of 2009 while trying to find her patrilineal Gannon line of her husband by convincing him to take a Y-DNA test. Autosomal DNA testing started to become commonplace 2 years later, and she has been hooked ever since. There's many ways to say autosomal DNA incorrectly. Autosomal is how you spell it. You can look it up. But by the end of this presentation, maybe you'll know what it is. Now, Lisa, she has been doing genealogy for about 22 years and genetic genealogy for the past 6 years. The combination has truly become a passion for her, partly because she comes from 4 generations of adoptees. Before DNA, research to find birth families was extremely limited. As a result, she now thrives on working with DNA in adoptee and other unknown parentage cases to assist in finding birth families. To date, she is proud to have taken on over 100 such cases, with the majority having successful conclusions. So please welcome Eileen and Lisa as they present DNA and genetic genealogy.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Thank you, Dave, and welcome everybody to Genetic Genealogy Beyond the Cousins. I'm Eileen. I'm pleased to co-host this session on autosomal DNA with my friend and fellow member of the Twin Force Genealogical Club, Lisa.
Hi, welcome everyone.
I hope that you've had the time or the opportunity to take a look at and possibly print out the handout we've provided. It does include some basic information that we hope will be helpful for DNA newbies especially. Plus, it has 2 pages of clickable links to news articles and internet resources that are related to some of the topics we're going to be talking about. The subtitle for our talk is Exploring Unique and Intriguing Pathways Through the Exciting Field of Genetic Genealogy. In other words, we're going to venture beyond the cousin matching that most of us have been doing for a while and are very familiar with. We're going to kind of go beyond that. Five reasons to have your DNA tested. Cousin matching, of course, finding living relatives, ethnicity estimates, finding birth families, identifying John and Jane Does, and assisting law enforcement personnel with violent criminal investigations. Most genealogists are familiar with the first 2 items, cousin matching and ethnicity estimates. We're not going to spend too much time on those first 2.
First, we're going to speak about our first reason, which is cousin matching. Cousin matches are found using autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA differs from Y DNA that measures direct paternal lines and mitochondrial DNA, which primarily measures direct maternal lines. So autosomal DNA is shared by both maternal and paternal relatives and is able to identify relatives usually within the most recent 4 to 6 generations. The amount of DNA you share between you and a match indicates how closely you are related to that person. So to find cousins, you can test at any of the testing companies. The major companies are listed in your handout, and those include Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. So a little more about the major testing companies. Ancestry DNA has the largest database, so it's usually recommended as the first site for somebody to test at. Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage accept uploads, often for free. So an example is if you test your DNA at Ancestry, you can add your results to both MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA. So then you're on 3 sites basically for the price of 1. That's important because the more sites your DNA is on, the better chance you have of finding someone who is only tested at 1 site. One thing about MyHeritage DNA, they tend to have a lot of European testers. So if you have recent European immigrants in your family tree, that may be important to you. There's also GEDmatch. And while GEDmatch is not a testing company, it accepts uploads for free from the other companies.
We'll talk a little bit about one of the basic things that you can do with your DNA matches, and that's look at your shared matches. This is really a basic skill. Every testing company and GEDmatch has the capability of giving you a list of matches that share DNA with you, and they also share DNA with a known match of yours. That list is your shared matches with the known match. And when that known match of yours is designated as a paternal or a maternal match, you'll be able to sort your entire match list via that shared matches tool into maternal and paternal branches and beyond. And that's a powerful thing to be able to do. A little bit more about known matches. For example, in Ancestry, I have a first cousin on my maternal side by the name of Marcia. If I find shared matches for Marcia, that Marcia and I shared, I can designate those matches then as my maternal side because Marcia is my maternal first cousin. Not only that, but I only need that one known match because by finding my maternal side, all of the matches on my maternal side, anybody else has to be in my paternal side. It's just kind of a no-brainer. Basic premise becomes that any matches that I share with Marcia are known to be from my maternal side, and any matches that I don't share with Marcia are known to be paternal. So separating your basic match list into maternal and paternal branches is the very first step toward amazing discoveries among your matches. Now, page 4 of our handout does give detailed instructions for finding shared matches at each of the testing companies and at GEDmatch. And of course, they all do it a little bit differently. So take a look at those instructions for finding shared matches on the site you tested on. Once you've mastered shared matches, you're ready for more advanced tools available at the different testing companies and at GEDmatch. More advanced tools in cousin matching, some additional tools at our disposal once we gain knowledge and skills beyond basic shared matches. Our chromosome browsers that are available at every testing company except Ancestry, and they're also available at GEDmatch. Some of you that have tested at Ancestry might be aware of their through lines at Ancestry, and a similar program at MyHeritage called Theories of Family Relativity. They both depend on online trees that you have posted to the site and the online trees of your matches in addition. Triangulation indicators with shared matches. They are available at MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and GEDmatch. There are cluster charts of shared matches to form family groups available at MyHeritage and GEDmatch. And then this fun tool called DNApainter.com, where you can actually paint your chromosomes with your matches. And they also have a tool that's called What Are the Odds? They call it the Watto tool. It's really interesting, and it is one of those advanced tools, but really fun to deal with. Then number 2 of the 5 reasons that we have to get your DNA tested is ethnicity estimates. Ethnicity estimates are available at every single testing company. They do encourage non-genealogists to get their DNA tested. Every company has its own reference group to compare your DNA to in order to come up with that ethnicity estimate. And as a result, estimates for the same individual might well vary from company to company. Resulting estimates are ancestors who lived hundreds or even 1,000 years ago. And that's in contrast to relatively recent 4 to 6 generation ancestors that are discovered with an autosomal DNA match. Really, the best estimate of ethnicity is at the continental level, but results continue to change over time as the companies update. Just one final comment. These estimates are called estimates for a reason. That's what they claim to be, and they shouldn't be taken too seriously. This slide illustrates the ethnicity estimates of 3 full sisters. Notice the consistency at the continental level. Sister A is 96.8% European. Sister B is 100% European. Sister C is 98.7% European. And then the company breaks it down. Sister A, her greatest percentage is 39.6, and they're calling that Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. Then they're saying she has about 21% Scandinavian, and the remaining 40% is broken down between East European, Balkan, Baltic, and there is some West Asian in there, which is, of course, a new continent. These are 3 full sisters now, you understand. Sister B, her largest percentage is 35.5% English, about 21% Baltic, and then 43.8% breaks down into Scandinavian, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, Balkan, Greek, and South Italian, and I have not a clue where that came from. Sister C, the biggest percentage, is quite a bit higher than the other two largest percentage, but that percentage is 61% North and West European, 21.8% English, and then 16.8% that's broken down Balkan, Baltic, and West Asian. There's that West Asian again. That's the only other continent that they're bringing into this whole thing. I had to actually look up what was considered West Asian, so it was kind of interesting. In essence, what it amounts to again is it's probably best to take these percentages with a grain of salt. Sometimes they improve with the updates. The companies, it seems like Ancestry especially, is updating their ethnicity estimates at least once a year, and the results of their updates may improve the situation as far as you're concerned, and sometimes they just get more confusing. Number 3 of 5 reasons to have your DNA tested, finding birth family. I'd like to tell you a story about my friend Missy. She's been wondering who her birth father was for decades. She first thought that she had the identity of her birth father narrowed down to 2 friends of her mother's around the time that she was born in 1970. One of them agreed to take a paternity test many years ago, and test results did confirm that he was not Missy's father. The second fellow, Dave, had passed away by this time, but Missy was friends with Dave's daughter, Sharon. Sharon readily agreed that her father was probably Missy's father, but she was not comfortable with having her DNA tested to confirm the half-sister relationship. At our request, Lisa stepped in and advised Missy to have her DNA tested with Ancestry because it has by far the largest database, 16 million and counting. We told Lisa of Missy's suspicion that Dave was her father, and Lisa then went to work on the Ancestry match list. Within a couple of days, Lisa was ready to meet with Missy and me to explain what she'd found. Surprise, Dave was not Missy's birth father. Missy left that meeting with the name of a paternal second cousin, Beth, who had also tested at Ancestry. She contacted Beth via email and found out that Beth was also a family genealogist who was able to put Missy in contact with the fellow who Beth thought might be Missy's half-brother, Steve. Steve told Missy that he had had his DNA tested, but unfortunately, the test was not done at Ancestry. He agreed to upload his raw data to DNA data to GEDmatch, where Missy's data had also been uploaded. At almost 1,500 centimorgan matches shared between Missy and Steve on GEDmatch, there's absolutely no doubt that Steve is Missy's half-brother. For someone who thought she was an only child, having a brother was a huge breakthrough for my friend. And even more exciting, she found out about a half-sister as well. Missy also had the opportunity to talk to her birth father, but was warned by Steve that the father would probably not be too receptive to the suggestion that she was his daughter. And that did turn out to be true. But the 3 half-siblings have been able to enjoy a great virtual relationship during the pandemic and hope to meet in person very soon. Happy ending to that story.
I'm going to share a story about Grace. Grace was doing genealogy research, and in the process, she found a newspaper article that stated her grandparents had adopted a baby. She quickly realized that this baby was actually her mother. The only information given about her mother in the article is that at the time of her birth, she was named Baby Heart. Neither Grace nor her mother, who had recently passed away, knew about this adoption. So after a little bit of shock, Grace sought out to find answers about her mother's biological family and she was referred to Eileen and I. So these are some basic genetic genealogy steps, and I'm going to illustrate these steps using Grace's story. They are included in your handout, so if you have that available, you can follow along with that also. Step 1 is to identify a group of shared matches. Step 2, using centimorgans of these matches to determine possible relationships. Step 3 is to use or build trees for the matches to determine a common ancestral couple. Step 4, build a descendant tree from this couple and identify the target generation. Next is step 5. By using centimorgans and research, narrow down the target list to come up with a theory. And step 6, seek confirmation to prove or disprove this theory. So again, in step 1, we identify a group of shared matches. This is an image of Grace's shared match list on Ancestry, and I've changed the names for her privacy. To find these shared matches, I first look at Grace's list of maternal matches. And her first match I found was Ruth Mack. I then was able to hit this shared matches button, and I come up with the names Dave Brown and Cynthia House in this cluster. All 3 of these people have small trees, which end up proving to be very helpful also. So for the next step, we're going to note this centimorgan number right here. It's 110. And Dave's right here is 108. And Cynthia's is 78. A centimorgan is a unit of genetic measurement used to describe how much DNA you share with someone. The more centimorgans you share with someone, the more closely you are related. This is a shared centimorgan tool that's available from DNApainter.com. And how this works is, you can follow my mouse if it wants to behave. There's a little box right here. You can enter the number of centimorgans you match with someone, and then this table will highlight all possible relationships that you could share with that person. It even gives you a ranking and a percentage of which are the highest probability. So I use this tool and entered the amounts Grace shares with Ruth and Dave and Cynthia. I determined that they were most likely in the 3rd cousin range, and 3rd cousins share great-grandparents. So going to step 3 is to use or build a tree for your matches to determine a common ancestral couple. I started with Dave, and I added his parents and his grandparents, his great-grandparents, and his great-great-grandparents. Then I looked at Ruth's tree, and I recognized the same couple. Then I go on next to Cynthia's tree, and I recognize this couple's at the top of her tree also, Donald Ham and Isabel Ward. So from this, I can now assume that Grace's grandparent is also descended from Donald Ham and Isabel Ward. My next step is to build a descendant tree for this couple and then identify the target generation. What is a target generation, you may ask? The target generation is where we expect to find Grace's grandparents. We know this based on predicted relationships and birth years. Since I know Grace's mom was born in 1929, Grace's grandparents must have been childbearing age at that time. So at the top, I have Donald and Isabel, and I list their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids, etc. If you notice in the green, I have Ruth, Dave, and Cynthia. That's where they ended up fitting in this tree. By looking at the dates, I determined that this is in the yellow is the target generation where I expect to find Grace's grandparent. Now, step 5 is to narrow down. Step 5 is to narrow down this target list to come up with a theory. First, I look at this row right here, and I have Alvin and Jim and Tammy, and they are the same age or younger than Grace's mother, so they can obviously not be her direct ancestor. And I'm gonna cross them off. Next, I go up here in the yellow row, and I see Oaklink. Oaklink died as an infant. Her sister Acklink never married and never had any children. And Icklink here died at age 13 before she had any children. So I'm gonna eliminate them. So left in this row, I have Ecklink and her spouse. Now this gets a little tricky, but I can eliminate Ecklink because if Ecklink was the grandparent of Grace, Grace would fit in the tree right about here. And she would be first cousins with Dave and Cynthia. First cousins share about 900 centimorgans, and this is way higher than Grace shares with Dave and Cynthia. So for that reason, I can X them off too. I can also eliminate Andy Ham up here because research showed that he died before he had any children. So this leaves Barbara Ham on the left. And over here, I have question marks under Bill Ham. I did extensive research on Bill Ham. I found he had moved to Canada, and I was unable to locate any evidence that he had had any children. So while it's possible he may have had children, it's less likely that this is where I'm going to find Grace's grandparent. So after learning that, I focused more information over here on the left with Barbara. I was able to find that Barbara was in the right place, about the right time, and was about 20 years old when Grace's mother was born. And in addition, she'd been married briefly to a man named Greg Hart. That may sound familiar if you remember Baby Hart. So from this, I come up with the theory that Barbara Ham and Greg Hart are Mary Elizabeth's parents and therefore Grace's grandparent. Step 6 is to seek confirmation to prove or disprove this theory. I did this in this case because with the information I found, Grace was able to go to the courts and got confirmation that Barbara and Greg were indeed Mary Elizabeth's parents. So at that point, the case was solved.
Great. I'm always impressed with that. Okay, number 4 of the 5 reasons to have your DNA tested, identifying John and Jane's Doe's. Genetic genealogy is a tool being used to identify unknown and often deceased persons, commonly referred to as John Doe or Jane Doe. At any given time, there are an estimated 40,000 Doe cases in the United States. The first Doe case, solved by the DNA Doe Project, and we'll talk more about them in a little bit, using genetic genealogy was in March 2018. And dozens of cases have been solved since then. Some of the solved cases are over 40 years old. This is a logo for the DNA Doe Project, one of the organizations that has made just incredible strides in identifying John and Jane Does using autosomal DNA and GEDmatch. A little bit more about the DNA Doe Project. The DNADoeProject.org is a nonprofit organization that uses genetic genealogy to identify John and Jane Does. It's made up entirely of volunteers and it includes over 60 experienced genetic genealogists. It was founded in 2017, solved its first case in March 2018, just 3 short years ago, and has since used genetic genealogy to solve dozens of cold cases. In addition to funding their own research, they also raised funds to extract and sequence DNA from human remains. And it's an expensive process that many government agencies can't afford to do on their own. So the DNA Doe Project helps out in that regard. The next 3 slides contain 20 pictures of the many cases that have been solved or partially solved since March of 2018. If you go to the website, and that website address is on the handout, each story is told. All of the success stories, descriptions of all of the current pending cases, and all of the active cases. A case is active once the DNA has been finished sequencing, a GEDmatch kit has been created for it, and it has been uploaded to GEDmatch. There's also a special section on the site describing those cases that are in the process of having funds raised for the benefit of a government agency that can't afford the DNA extracting and sequencing process on their own. On this particular slide, I'm going to tell the story of Lavender Doe, the young lady down in the bottom row, second from left. You may have seen this Jane Doe's case when it was featured on a recent episode of Dateline on the NBC network. Her body was discovered in Texas in 2006, and it was determined that she was recently deceased. Exact cause of death was undetermined, but the case was investigated as a homicide because of evidence left behind at the scene. In August of 2018, 12 years after her death, a person of interest actually confessed to the murder of Lavender Doe, but he was unsure of her identity. In February of 2019, as a direct result of the volunteer efforts of the DNA Doe Project, Lavender Doe was identified as a 21-year-old young lady from Florida. Mystery still remains about her life and disappearance. Apparently, she had not even been reported missing. Next, we're going to look at lower right-hand corner, Barron County, John Doe, 1982. And this is Barron County, Wisconsin. In the fall of 1982, remains were found 4 miles north of Ridgeland in Barron County, Wisconsin. Estimated time of death was April or May of that same year, 1982. And the cause of death was determined to be 3 puncture wounds to the chest area. In January 2020, as a direct result of the volunteers at the DNA Doe Project, the Barron County Sheriff's Department was finally able to announce the identity of that homicide victim as Craig Patrick King of Ramsey County, Minnesota. He was last seen in the fall of 1981, and they discovered his remains, as I said, like about a year later. The Sheriff's Department is now focusing their attention on trying to solve Craig's murder investigation. Here we're going to look at Maury County, Jane Doe, 1975. Maury County, Jane Doe is one of the Doe cases on the DNA Doe Project site that is needing contributions to help pay for testing. And her story is, they don't have much of a story, but what we know is what I'm going to tell you. On February 14th, 1975, 2 hunters found human skeletal remains in a wooded area 2 miles from Joe Brown Road off Highway 99 East near I-65 in Maury County, Tennessee. A red shell blouse, flowered blue slacks, female undergarments, and black Italian-made wedge shoes were found with her remains. A forensic anthropologist concluded that the deceased was a Black African-American female, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighing approximately 132 pounds, with black hair. Authorities speculate that she had been in an automobile accident or run over by a car during the autumn of 1974, 6 to 9 months prior to her body being found.
This is a sad collection of cases from Minnesota I wanted to share. In 1999, a newborn little girl was found in the water near Red Wing, Minnesota. Several years later, in 2003, a little boy was found on the shore of Lake Pepin. DNA determined that this baby and the first baby were closely related. They likely shared a mother or had mothers that were siblings. In 2007, another newborn girl was found in a marina near Treasure Island Casino. She is believed to have been Native American or Hispanic and is unrelated to the first two babies. The Goodhue County Sheriff recently learned of genetic genealogy and started fundraising efforts to raise the $15,000 needed. Funds were raised as of August for further genetic testing. A little bit more about the babies. They were all born alive. The first two had umbilical cords still attached and are believed to have been in the water for a week or two when they were found. And the third little girl was likely in the water for several months. Their cause of death has never been released. These cases are all now in the hands of genetic genealogists at Parabon Nanolabs, and I'm hopefully anticipating updates sometime soon. It would be nice to finally have names to the faces of these little baby does.
Number 5 of 5 reasons to test your DNA, assisting law enforcement personnel in violent criminal investigations. I'm hoping that most of you are aware of the Golden State Killer, which we think was one of the first criminals to be apprehended using this system of using autosomal DNA and GEDmatch. There is a link to an article with more details about this case if you're interested in the handout. But just briefly, over a period of 44 years, California detectives had been trying to determine the identity of a male predator who terrorized the state north to south with a string of horrific sexual assaults and homicides in the 1970s and 80s. Investigators and genetic genealogists teamed together to create a DNA profile with DNA that was recovered from the crime scene, and that was submitted to GEDmatch as raw DNA data of the criminal. By building out many family trees of third and fourth cousin DNA matches, they were able to create a roadmap to the killer via his great grandparents who lived in the 1800s. So as soon as they had a name, the officer's chore was to find some fresh DNA from this individual. They scooped up an item discarded by the man that contained his fresh DNA. It was found to be a match to the killer's DNA, and Joseph DeAngelo was arrested on April 24th, 2018. There's a link to more details of this story in the handout. Want to mention Barbara Ray Venter, a genetic genealogist, and she is best known for her work helping police and investigators identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bear Brook murders. This is actually a criminal case and also a doe case. In 1985, 2 bodies were found in 55-gallon barrel at Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire. 15 years later, right in the same area, probably there the whole time, was a second barrel with 2 more young victims in that one. They were all believed to have died somewhere between 1978 and 1981, and they were all murdered by Terry Rasmussen. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Terry Rasmussen. Terry Rasmussen was a serial killer known as the Chameleon Killer. He went by several aliases, including Bob Evans, Gordon Jensen, Curtis Mayo Kimball, Jerry Mockerman, and Larry Vanner. He is presumed to have killed at least 7 people across the country. Some more about Rasmussen's life. He was married in 1968, and he actually had 4 children with his wife. He was later separated, and the wife left and took the children. Sometime around the time of this separation, he fathered a daughter with a woman whose identity has never been found. Next, he dated a woman named Marlise Honeychurch, who had 2 young children from a previous relationship. Marlise and her 2 children, Marie and Sarah, are 3 of the victims found at Bear Brook State Park. In 1981, he began a relationship with a woman named Denise, who was the mother of an infant daughter. Several years later, he was raising this child he called Lisa alone. He eventually abandoned her with a neighbor. DNA at the time was able to determine that Rasmussen was no relationship to the child. Lisa's mother has never been found and is presumed dead. He later married again and was finally arrested in 2002 for the murder of this wife, Unsun. He died in prison a few years later in 2010. Rasmussen's true identity, however, was not determined until 2017, 7 years after he died. Genetic genealogy was first used in this case by forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Ventnor. It was crucial in connecting him to his many aliases to one person. The same methods that were used to reveal the identity of Rasmussen were used to determine the true identity of the little girl he called Lisa, as well as the identities of Marlise, Marie, and Sarah, who were not identified until 2019. Genetic genealogy is currently being used to determine the identity of Rasmussen's biological daughter, who is the 4th Bear Brook victim. So far, they've been able to determine that her family was likely from Pearl River County, Mississippi. And that's what they've figured out so far. So hopefully they'll know more in the future. I have one last story to share. This is a 44-year-old cold case from Minnesota. It is actually the first criminal case in Minnesota to use genetic genealogy, and it's currently being litigated. Parabon Nanolabs recently helped investigators in Chisholm, Minnesota, identify the alleged killer of 38-year-old Nancy Doherty. He has been arrested and is currently awaiting trial. Nancy had been found dead in her home in 1976 after being sexually assaulted and strangled. And due to the sensitive nature of this open case, we just chose to highlight the victim tonight and not the alleged killer.
Okay. What DNA can and cannot do? Autosomal DNA, as used in genetic genealogy, cannot, in and of itself, solve law enforcement criminal investigations. What the DNA does do, the DNA can, however, indicate a direction for genetic genealogists to take in terms of creating a link to a possible suspect's DNA matches. Then good old-fashioned genealogy research kicks in and completes the path to the alleged criminal by building multiple family trees. The article about the Golden State Killer mentions that over the course of 4 months, 25 different trees were created from those great grandparents that we talked about. down to the suspect, and each person in those trees had to be eliminated, one by one, to end up with the suspect that they ended up with. Once a suspect has been tentatively identified, DNA steps in once again to confirm the identity of the suspect, who can then be brought to trial. We've mentioned GEDmatch a lot this evening. Here's some basic information about GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a primarily free database used almost exclusively by genetic genealogists to assist in solving John and Jane Doe cases and also criminal cases for law enforcement. GEDmatch accepts uploads of autosomal DNA data from all of the DNA testing companies. Do check out the handout for a link to GEDmatch site itself and a tutorial for beginners. After creating a free account, you'll find directions explaining how to upload your DNA data to get matches, just like you do at any of the other sites, and also how to use some of the tools available at the site. Regarding law enforcement, raw DNA data uploaded to GEDmatch is not available to law enforcement unless you specifically give them permission by opting in to that function on the GEDmatch site. And of course, none of the investigative work with the John and Jane Does or law enforcement is possible without your DNA and GEDmatch. Happy sleuthing with your DNA.
We hope that you have enjoyed our presentation this evening. And now we'll take a little time to answer some questions.
Okay. Wow. First, I got to say that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. We've got a couple of notes and a question here. But first, I've got one of my own. I'm just going to pop in there. The case in Chisholm, Minnesota. They also have another case of a missing girl 25 years later or so, or she went by the nickname of Beaner. So yeah, they've got a couple things going on up there. And that's just a lost girl that they've never found. She was a 4 or 5 year old girl, I believe. So maybe, you never know. We're getting a few applause for you in the chats. There was one mention from Al to remind us that they're using DNA to find who our service people were who are lost, both overseas that are being repatriated to the United States and given proper burials, including some local people. I'm sorry, I can't think of their names right now. If I'd had time to look it up, I could, but we've had local people who have recently been repatriated and buried locally from after having been gone since World War II.
Yeah,
And
it's incredible. It's incredible. It really is.
I've got a big question here. This is from Paulette, and Paulette writes, we know that our great-great-grandmother was married and had our great-grandmother from that marriage. So great-great-grandmother had a daughter. We have the name of her husband, and I'm assuming that's the great-great-grandmother's husband. But soon after their child's birth, it was discovered that he was already married and had children already, a bigamist. The marriage ended and he disappeared. Imagine that. Searching Ancestry has not revealed his identity or location. Our great-grandmother, which would be the daughter, wanted no part of him, and all we have is his given name and nickname. What would be the best method to find out who he was and whether we have cousins out there? Question mark.
That's a good question, Dave. I appreciate you giving us the longest question first. If you've tested at Ancestry, that's going to be the first thing to do to try to get some answers. You're basically looking for the identity
of the great-great-grandfather.
The great-great-grandfather. So a great-great-grandfather is, you're going to be looking for about third cousin matches. So if you did your DNA and you were able to first divide your maternal side from your paternal side, if you know, you're going to know some of your matches. And I would expect that you would find a cluster of matches, a group of matches that in common are going to come from the spot where you're looking.
Yeah.
Yes. He had already had children with the other family.
Right.
So something close to a third cousin match would be about in the ballpark of what they want to look for. And that third cousin would be somebody probably or possibly living today even.
Yep.
So
Probably about the 100-something centimorgan
Yeah,
range.
that's what I'm
Yeah,
thinking, about a
yeah.
hundred centimorgans.
Yeah.
so get the
So when
DNA.
you find matches at that level that you don't recognize, that would be a good place to look.
Yeah, that would be. What have you got, Dave?
I got a DNA kit right here. Yeah, your presentation kind of wowed me, so I went out and got a couple, one for me, one for my wife, while you were talking. And we're going to do that. And then if they come back successfully, my in-laws are going to both do it too. I hear from
Okay,
them.
great.
And I got one more comment for Paulette that Eileen and I have included our email in the handout. And if I'd be willing to talk to you some more and see what I could find out for you if you send me some more info later.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Next, here's an interesting one from Tara. I recently heard that they made art from DNA from a cigarette butt. Made art. I'm sure the word's not out that we're looking for there. From DNA from a cigarette butt and created exact replica of facial features. Is this true? Can you make facial features from DNA?
Yes, actually.
Oh boy, I'm glad she could answer that, because
Parabon, I mentioned them earlier as Parabon Nanolabs. I think there's a broader name, has a program, I believe it's called Snapshot. And they're actually taking DNA and coming out with physical characteristics and images of people just based on their DNA. And there may have been some, when you saw the DNA dose slides, some of those are probably old, some are drawings, some are looks how they almost were made with the clay they did in the old days.
Okay. One more thing about Parabon, and this is something I saw not too long ago. Law enforcement has been using Parabon to help them out, but they're not having real good luck getting accurate pictures, we'll call them, or images of the African American community, and there's been some issues with that. So it's more or less, I don't know if it's out of favor, but they're working on it.
Yep. It's getting better.
Yep.
When you think of what this whole what all genetic genealogy has accomplished in such a short period of time, it just truly is mind-boggling, I think. And they're working on all this stuff, and they'll get there, but it's going to take more time.
They recently had a study they were doing, and they were asking volunteers to submit DNA and facial images. And I think they're just trying to improve the technology all the time.
All right. We'll hit one more question here, or a comment. I hope this encourages everyone to upload to GEDmatch and opt in to use the law enforcement. These poor families who have murdered family members need our help to find those responsible. It's just a comment, and myself, I agree with that, and that's part of why I'm going to be doing that.
Yeah. And of course, Lisa and I feel the same way, and we realize there's hesitation. And I do understand the hesitation. We do understand the hesitation, but that was the kind of the purpose of our doing this presentation, kind of a little bit off the beaten track, like, in the direction that we did, because it's an interest of hers, it's an interest of mine also. But we just really want to educate people, not try to talk you into doing anything, just educate people so that you're not just hearing rumors about what'll happen if you upload to GEDmatch, or but try to see the positive side of what will happen. But like I said, not really to talk anybody into it, just to get the real facts about what's going on.
Okay. Question from Al. Do you think Y-DNA, mtDNA, and xDNA are helpful?
Oh boy, Lisa's looking at me.
Do I got it. I got you. want-
um, is Al talking about just, in terms of doing basic genealogy, trying to find ancestors?
I'll check with them and we'll come back to that.
Okay.
I think I got a comment. I think they're all helpful for different reasons.
Yeah.
Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA are not gonna find cousins and help you build your tree for the recent generations. It's not gonna usually help you find birth family. Y-DNA tracks your father's 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 father. So sometimes it's helpful to try to solve a mystery with a surname, but surnames often change too. So there is a benefit, but not finding really close matches.
Yeah. I just briefly, we're probably running out of time, but I did mention, or you mentioned, David, in my introduction, that I got started on this whole thing because I've been trying to find the Gannon line. So that was the very first thing that I did, was have my husband test the Y-DNA. And very naively, I expected to get all kinds of Gannons in his matches. It was 4 years before I got my first Gannon match on the Y-DNA. The Y-DNA does not change. This is why, it goes back so far. This is why it's not helpful in terms of finding living cousins, because it does not change. It basically does not change as it's passed down through the generations. And I now have a few more Gannon names, at least surnames, in his match list, in his Y-DNA match list, but I haven't found anybody yet that usually most of those people that do match him surname wise have also tested their autosomal DNA, and they're not showing up in my husband's autosomal matches, in his more recent cousin matches. So it's a tricky business. And my understanding is that mitochondrial DNA is even worse than that.
Okay. Let's take a look at one more question. This one's really pertinent to a lot of people who don't understand how the DNA works. How can a brother and sister have such a disparity in DNA? Let's get about the short version answer to that.
The DNA is passed down so randomly. Each sibling gets 50% of their DNA from their mother and 50% from their father. Each sibling does, but it's a different 50%. It's enough centimorgans. We talked about centimorgans. It's enough shared that we can call you definitely full siblings or half siblings, or whatever the case may be. But it's a different 50%. And that happens with every single generation. So by the time you're talking great grandparents who share who their descendants are third cousins, it's been randomly distributed so broadly that even third cousins sometimes don't match on the matching systems, on Ancestry, on Heritage, on GEDmatch. Sometimes third cousins don't match. I have that example in my own family on both sides, my husband's family and my family. And fourth cousins only match 50% of the time, and fifth cousins only match.
It goes down from there.
Yeah, it goes down from there. It's such random, you can illustrate it.
If we had a bowl of M&Ms, and I took a handful, and Eileen or my match took a handful, we would have some in common, but we would not have exactly the same.
Yeah.
How about identical twins?
Identical twins share the 100% the same DNA.
Yeah.
So a child of one of the twins will if one of the children tests, they will match both of them as parents. They will match their parent and their, let's say, aunt, their mother and their aunt. They were both matched them as a child.
But they do say, like she said, identical twins, their picture, their DNA picture is exactly the same.
So I saw the question, if you had two identical twins that both had children that with different, I'm just saying women, for example, with two different men, the children would match as half siblings.
Okay.
Even though they're technically
First cousins.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for those questions. Those that we did not get to, we'll see if we can get to them after Thomas's presentation. So hang tight. If you have follow-up questions, there's emails available, so you can certainly email questions. But right now we're going to get ready for our second presentation.